That night, Chicago lay under the coldest rain of November. Water came down on the pavement, as if it meant to wash everything away. And inside a convenience store in a poor neighborhood on the edge of the city, the night clerk was in the middle of a long yawn when the glass door flew open. A little boy stepped inside, 7 years old, so thin that the light coat on his body looked as though it had been hung on a hook. Wet brown hair clung to his forehead, and his clothes were soaked through from head to toe, as if he had stood out in the rain for a very long time before he found the courage to cross this doorway. The clerk looked at the boy, at those wide gray eyes streaked red, then dropped his gaze to the counter and waited for him to say something. But the boy didn't speak. He didn't open his mouth at all. Instead, a small trembling hand pushed a piece of paper across the counter. Drenched, crumpled, the childish pencil scrawl almost completely blurred away. The clerk picked it up, tilted it beneath the flickering neon light, and read, "Please call an ambulance. My mother is dying." The clerk looked at the note, looked at the boy, then he shook his head. "Listen, this isn't an emergency call station. Go somewhere else." The boy didn't move. He stood there, eyes lifted to the man behind the counter, as if looking long enough, looking hard enough, might make a person change his mind. But the clerk snapped. "I told you already. Go. I'm busy." The boy stepped back out into the rain. He ran across the street to the gas station. He pushed the note against the glass of the cashier booth. The person inside glanced down, then turned away, as if the child were just another part of the storm, something unpleasant that would disappear on its own. He kept running. A late-night diner on the corner, warm yellow light spilling through windows clouded with steam. The boy stood outside the door and held up the note to a man who was walking out. The man gave it a quick look, frowned, then hurried on without turning back. 3 doors. 3 times a door slammed shut in the face of a 7-year-old child who couldn't speak a single word. Micah Holden stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Rain crashed down around him. The paper in his hand had turned to pulp, the writing almost completely gone now, but he still held on to it, as if it were the only thing keeping his mother alive. He didn't cry. Micah had forgotten how to cry in front of strangers a very long time ago. Some children grow up on laughter. Micah had grown up on silence. The kind of silence he had learned meant that if he stayed quiet enough, small enough, invisible enough, fists wouldn't find him. But tonight, silence was killing his mother. The boy turned, ready to run back to the alley where his mother lay. But before he did, he stopped beside the trash can in front of the convenience store. His small fingers searched through it, then pulled out a plastic bottle someone had thrown away, with a few drops of water still clinging to the bottom. He shoved it into his coat pocket. Then he ran. He didn't know that from inside a black car parked about 20 yards away, a man was watching him. Cade Mercer, 37 years old, the boss who controlled most of the underground activity in the southern outskirts of Chicago, the man whose name alone made even the most reckless people know to lower their heads, sat in the back seat of a black sedan and watched through rain-streaked glass. He had seen it all. The boy going into the store, the note, the shake of the head, the child running across the street, the gas station, the diner, 3 times being turned away, and now this, a 7-year-old digging through a trash can for a half-empty bottle of water. Under the rain, in the middle of the night, all alone, Priest, Cade's bodyguard, opened the car door and got in, a pack of cigarettes in his hand. He saw that Cade's eyes were still fixed on the small figure running into the darkness at the far end of the street. "Boss?" Cade didn't look at Priest. "Follow the kid." Priest blinked. "What?" I said follow him. The black car pulled silently away from the curb, trailing the tiny shape racing through the rain. Micah turned down one street, then another, then slipped into a dark alley, the kind of alley ordinary people wouldn't walk into in broad daylight, let alone in the middle of the night. Cade opened the car door and stepped out. Rain struck him full in the face, bitter cold. Priest came after him, one hand already resting at his waist. Then Cade saw it. At the far end of the alley, beneath the one weak street lamp still burning, Micah was kneeling on the ground beside a figure slumped motionless against a brick wall. A woman, light brown hair plastered to her face by the rain, skin so pale it nearly disappeared into the wall behind her. She didn't move. The boy pulled the bottle from his pocket, twisted the cap off with both shaking hands, then tipped it carefully and let the water fall, one drop at a time, onto the woman's lips, carefully, slowly. as if he had done this many times before, so many times that it had become instinct. 7 years old, kneeling in the rain, giving his mother water he had fished out of a trash can, Cade Mercer stood at the mouth of the alley and looked at that scene. And for the first time in many years, something inside his chest, something he had believed died 25 years ago, stirred, and that was only the beginning. Because the woman lying in that alley that night carried a secret that could destroy the empire of the most dangerous enemy Cade had ever faced, and that enemy had already begun to look for her. If you'd like to know what Cade Mercer did that night, and what secret that woman was carrying, leave a like on this story. Share the video with people who need to hear a story worth hearing. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the moment. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next part. Cade moved forward. Each of his footsteps echoed over the wet concrete, blending with the sound of rain hammering down on the tin roofs of the abandoned buildings on either side. Priest stayed close behind him, one hand still resting at his waist, his eyes sweeping quickly through the darkness with the habit of a man who had lived too long in a world where any shadowed corner could hide a bullet. But Cade wasn't looking into the darkness. He was looking toward the light, the weak street lamp at the far end of the alley, where the boy was kneeling beside the motionless woman. Cade moved closer. Micah didn't look up. The boy was still tilting the bottle, carefully letting each drop fall onto his mother's lips, as if the whole world had narrowed down to that one single task, and he wouldn't stop until there wasn't a drop left. Cade knelt beside the woman. Up close, he could see more clearly what the darkness had hidden from the mouth of the alley. She was young, perhaps not yet 30, but her face carried the exhaustion of someone aged by something worse than time. Light brown hair clung wetly to her forehead and neck. Her skin was so pale it looked almost transparent beneath the streetlight, faint blue veins showing along her temples. Her lips were purple, her eyes were shut tight. Cade placed 2 fingers against her neck, just below the corner of her jaw. He waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. His heart was beating faster than usual, which rarely happened to a man who was used to seeing death at close range. Then he felt it. A pulse, so weak it was like a thread about to snap, but still there. He laid the back of his hand against her forehead. Hot. So hot that his fingers almost pulled away. Her body was soaked and freezing on the outside, but inside she was burning. A high fever. Very high. Boss. Priest stood a few steps away, his voice low. Call 911 and leave. This isn't our problem. Cade didn't answer at once. He looked down at the woman's wrist, where her sleeve had slipped back while he was checking her pulse. Bruises. Not the kind left by a fall or an ordinary bump. Long marks, shaped like fingers, dark purple and black, circling her wrist like a bracelet made by someone squeezing with all his strength. Cade had seen too many kinds of wounds in his life. He knew which injuries came from accidents, and which came from intent. These bruises belonged to the second kind. He looked up. Micah was still kneeling there. The boy had stopped dripping water because the bottle was empty now. But he didn't let it go. He held it in both hands against his chest, as if he let go, he wouldn't know what to do with his empty hands. Gray eyes looked at Cade. No words, no pleading, just looking. But in those eyes was everything his mouth couldn't say. Please, please do something. I've tried everything. I have no one else left. Cade stood up. He took off his coat, the black leather coat that cost more than 6 months of rent in this neighborhood, and draped it over the woman. Then he pulled out his phone. Call Park, he said to Priest. Tell her to come to my house, right now. Priest didn't move. Boss, she's your doctor, not hers. Right now, Priest. Cade's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Priest had followed Cade long enough to know that the softer his voice became, the less possible it was to argue with the order. Priest pulled out his phone, turned away, and dialed. Cade made another call. The second car arrived within 10 minutes. The driver and Priest carefully lifted the woman onto the back seat. Cade stayed beside Micah. The boy had gotten to his feet at some point. The torn backpack on his back looked heavier than the thin body beneath it. His hand gripped the strap so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Cade crouched down until he was at the boy's eye level. Your mother's going to be treated, he said. Get in the car. Micah didn't move. Rain ran down the boy's face, but he didn't blink. Then he did something Cade never forgot. The boy lifted one hand and pointed at the car where his mother was lying. Then he pointed at his own chest. Then he pointed at the car again. No words were needed. The meaning was so clear that language became unnecessary. Wherever my mother goes, I go. There is no second choice. There is no negotiation. Cade nodded. The boy climbed into the car and sat beside his mother, placing his hand on her forehead, checking her temperature. 7 years old, and yet the gesture carried the care of someone who had been looking after another person for too long, too early, too alone. Cade sat in the front seat. The car rolled out of the alley, onto the main road, heading north. The rain kept falling. He looked into the rearview mirror. Micah sat motionless beside his mother, his hand still resting on her forehead, his eyes wide open in the dark, and Cade realized something that made his chest tighten. The boy wasn't afraid of the dark. He wasn't afraid of strangers. He wasn't afraid of the black car in the middle of the night. The only thing he was afraid of was losing his mother, and that fear was greater than everything else put together. The car stopped in front of the mansion at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. The rain still hadn't let up, but it had lost some of its violence, shifting from a pounding downpour into the kind of cold, stubborn drizzle that seeped into everything. The iron gates opened automatically as the car rolled in. The 2 guards nodded when they saw Cade's car, but their eyes lingered longer than usual on the figure of the woman lying in the back seat. No one asked questions. Cade Mercer's men didn't ask questions when the answers didn't belong to them. Priest and the driver carried Elise into the house through the back entrance. Cade went in ahead of them and gave short orders to the house staff to prepare the upstairs sitting room, the one with the fireplace, the wide bed, the one closest to the staircase, so Dr. Park could move easily back and forth. Elise was laid carefully onto the bed. Under the lights inside the house, she looked worse than she had in the alley. Her skin wasn't just pale anymore, it was almost gray, and the layer of dirt and dried rainwater on her cheeks made her face look like a wax figure left behind and forgotten. Her breathing was shallow and fast, her chest rising in short, broken waves as if every breath were its own battle. Dr. Una Park arrived 15 minutes later. She stepped into the room carrying a black leather bag, her hair pinned up neatly, her eyes alert even after being pulled out of bed in the middle of the night. She didn't ask Cade who the woman was. She never asked questions like that. She simply pulled a chair to the bedside, opened her bag, and began to work. Body temperature close to 40 degrees. Wet crackling sounds in both lungs, especially bad on the left side. Rapid, weak pulse. Low blood pressure. She pushed back Elise's sleeve to place the IV line, and Cade saw her pause for the briefest moment when she noticed the bruises on the woman's wrist. Only for a moment. Then she continued setting the line, her expression unchanged. When she was finished, she stepped into the hallway and spoke to Cade in a calm voice, as though she were reading a grocery list. Severe pneumonia, malnutrition, serious dehydration. She needs high-dose antibiotics, continuous fluids, and at least 1 week of rest. She paused and looked at Cade. And she needs food. Her stomach is almost empty. She didn't say anything more about the bruises. She only wrote in her private notebook, closed it, and slipped it back into her bag. But her eyes, when they met Cade's, said more than her mouth did. Cade nodded. She would return tomorrow morning. While Dr. Park examined Elise upstairs, Micah sat on the sofa in the downstairs sitting room. One of the house staff had brought out a thick wool blanket, a glass of warm milk, and a plate of bread. Everything still sat untouched on the table. The boy sat with his legs drawn up onto the sofa, his backpack still on his back, his eyes fixed on the staircase. He didn't move. He didn't look at the food. He didn't look at anyone else in the room. He only stared at the stairs, as if he watched long enough, his mother would come walking down. Cade came down the staircase. He looked at the untouched plate of bread, looked at the milk growing cold, looked at the boy. He moved the glass of milk a little closer to Micah. The boy glanced down, then gave a faint shake of his head, a tiny gesture, but final. Cade understood. The boy wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't truly breathe until he knew his mother was still alive. "Your mother is being cared for by the doctor," Cade said. "She's very good." No response. The boy's eyes stayed locked on the stairs. Cade tried again. "Do you want to go upstairs and see your mother?" For the first time since coming into the house, Micah turned and looked at Cade. Then he nodded. One quick nod, as though he were afraid that if he nodded too slowly, the offer would disappear. Cade led him upstairs to the room. Micah walked in and saw his mother lying on the bed, the IV line in her arm, her face still white as paper, but at least now a warm blanket had been pulled up to her chest. The boy set his backpack on the floor, dragged a chair over beside the bed, climbed up onto it, and slipped his small hand into his mother's. He held on tight, and just like that, less than 5 minutes later, Micah fell asleep. His head slumped onto the edge of the bed, his wet hair tangled and wild, his clothes still not fully dry, but his hand never let go. Even in sleep, those small fingers stayed curled tight around his mother's hand. Cade stood in the doorway, leaning back against the frame, watching the scene in front of him, and suddenly, as if someone had pulled back an old curtain inside his mind, he saw another image laid over it. Not a brown-haired boy, but a blonde-haired girl. The girl lying in a bed, eyes closed, her hand turning colder and colder, and a 12-year-old boy sitting beside her, holding her hand, calling her name, but she wasn't answering anymore. Cade blinked. The image vanished. In front of him once again were Micah and Elise. He stepped back into the hallway and closed the door quietly. The next 3 days passed through the mansion like a silent dream. Dr. Park came twice a day, morning and evening, checking the IV fluids, listening to Elise's lungs, taking her temperature, writing notes. She came and went without saying much. Priest took shifts outside the bedroom door, not because Cade ordered him to, but because he did it on his own, a habit formed after many years of guarding the things Cade considered important. Micah never left the room. The boy ate very little, only a few pieces of bread and half a glass of milk each day, just enough not to faint. He went into the bathroom by himself, washed his face by himself, and on the morning of the second day, Cade passed the bathroom and saw through the half-open door something that made him stop. Micah was standing on a small chair, leaning over the sink, washing his own t-shirt by hand. 7 years old, standing on a chair because he still wasn't tall enough to reach the faucet, wringing the water out by himself, spreading the shirt across the edge of the sink to dry by himself. No one had taught him. No one had told him he had to do it. He did it because there was no one else who would do it for him. Cade stood there for 3 seconds. Then he walked on. Every day, he stopped by Elise's room. He didn't go in. He only opened the door, looked inside, made sure the tray of food on the table beside the bed had been replaced with a fresh one, made sure the IV bottle hadn't run dry, made sure the boy was still sitting there. Then he closed the door again. Priest asked only once, on the evening of the second day, "Boss, how long are you going to keep them here?" Cade was reading documents in his study. He didn't look up. As long as needed. Priest didn't ask again. On the morning of the third day, weak sunlight slipped through the curtains of the upstairs sitting room, falling in a long stripe across the wooden floor. Elise Holden opened her eyes, not with the slow return of someone waking from deep sleep, but with the sudden jolt of someone breaking the surface after sinking underwater. Eyes wide, breath coming fast, body drawn tight as if bracing to fight off something unseen. She looked at the white ceiling. Unfamiliar. Looked at the cream-colored wall. Unfamiliar. Looked at the slender hanging lamp above her. Unfamiliar. Nothing was familiar. Her heart began to pound wildly. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. Her trembling arm buckled the moment she pushed against the mattress, and the IV line tugging at her wrist made her flinch and look down, only to grow more alarmed when she saw the needle fixed into her vein. Then she called out, her voice hoarse, breaking from a throat gone dry like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in days. "Micah." No answer came. The room stayed silent. Her heart beat faster. "Micah!" The second call was louder, more desperate, carrying that raw and ancient terror of a mother who doesn't know where her child is. She tried to turn, and then, from the chair pulled close beside the bed, the one she hadn't seen because it sat on the other side, a small hand closed around hers. Then came a voice. Small, whispered, so faint it would have been almost impossible to hear if the room hadn't been so still. "I'm here. You're safe." Elise turned her head. Micah was sitting in the chair, his legs drawn up, his gray eyes fixed on her. He looked smaller than she remembered, thinner, dark circles under his eyes, but the hand holding hers was steady and warm. It was the first time in this story that the boy spoke out loud, and he didn't speak to anyone except his mother. Elise pulled her son into her arms. She held him with both arms. Never mind the IV line pulling tight. Never mind the ache in her body. Never mind anything else. She held Micah and cried. Not loudly, but with the kind of crying that comes from someone who has held it in for too long, tears spilling without sound, shoulders trembling faintly, mouth pressed tight. as if she had learned long ago that crying out loud only brought worse things. Micah didn't say anything more. He rested his head against his mother's chest, listening to her heartbeat, and lay still. A few minutes passed. Elise slowly opened her eyes and looked around the room again, this time more slowly, more carefully. A wide bed with spotless white sheets, a dark wooden cabinet, a large window hidden behind heavy curtains, an electric fireplace in the corner giving off warmth. On the bedside table sat a tray of food, porridge, bread, water, all arranged neatly. Everything was clean, expensive, and completely strange. Elise held Micah tighter. She didn't know where she was. She didn't remember how she had come here. The last thing she remembered was the alley, the rain, her body refusing to obey her anymore, and Micah trying to give her water. Then darkness, then this. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, heavy, slow. Stopping at the door, Elise immediately pulled Micah closer against her, her instinct forcing the boy's body behind her even though she still wasn't strong enough to sit upright. The door opened. Cade Mercer stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, face unreadable. The light from the hallway behind him outlined his shape and made him look less like a real man than like a shadow in the form of one. Elise looked at him, and everything inside her screamed the same word. Dangerous. She pulled Micah closer. The boy didn't resist, but he wasn't afraid either. He looked at Cade, then lightly touched his mother's arm, as if trying to tell her something she didn't yet understand. "You're in my house," Cade said. His voice was flat, neither warm nor cold. "Who brought me here?" "I did." "Why?" Cade looked over at Micah. The boy looked back at him. Between the two of them there seemed to be a kind of language Elise couldn't yet read. "Because the boy wouldn't give up," Cade said. Elise didn't understand. She looked down at her son. Micah touched her hand lightly, then raised his arm and pointed toward Cade. A small gesture. Simple, but clear. "He helped us." Elise looked back at Cade. Her eyes were still wary, still measuring him, still searching for the trap she had learned to look for in every kind word. Because Elise Holden had learned, through broken ribs and scars across her back, that no one gives without taking something in return. No one is kind without a price. "What do you want?" she asked directly. Her voice was weak, but not soft. Cade looked at her. 1 second, 2 seconds, then he spoke. "Go to sleep. You need rest." He turned away, stepped back into the hallway. The door closed softly. It didn't slam. It didn't lock. It only shut. Elise stared at the closed door. Micah still lay quietly in her arms, his breathing slowly evening out. She didn't trust that man. She didn't trust this room. She didn't trust anything that had happened since the moment she opened her eyes. But her body had surrendered before her mind could object. Her eyes grew heavier. Warmth from the fireplace spread through the room. Micah breathed steadily beside her, and Elise Holden, for the first time in a very long while, was too exhausted to be afraid. There was one thing Elise never let out of her reach, even when she lay in bed with an IV line taped to her arm: the backpack. That torn gray backpack sat right beside the bed, pressed against the wall, in exactly the spot her hand could reach if she needed it. Every time she woke, the first thing she did wasn't to look around the room or check the IV line. It was to lower her hand and touch the strap of the backpack. Still there, still in place. Only then did she let out a breath. Cade noticed that from the very first day, he noticed the way Elise always kept the backpack within reach, the way she flinched whenever anyone came near it. The way Micah also knew he wasn't supposed to touch his mother's backpack, as if it were an unspoken rule between the two of them. On the evening of the 4th day, while Elise had fallen into a deep sleep from the fever medicine and Micah lay curled beside his mother, Cade stepped into the room, lightly, silently. He had spent his whole life in a world where footsteps had to be quieter than breath, so the wooden floor didn't make a sound beneath his shoes. He crouched beside the bed, pulled the backpack toward him, and opened the zipper. There wasn't much inside. 2 sets of children's clothes, folded neatly but worn thin with age. A box of cold medicine nearly empty. A plastic bag holding a few papers. And at the bottom of the backpack, lying between a small sweater and a birth certificate bearing the name Micah James Holden, was a black USB drive. Small. No label. Nothing unusual about it on the outside. Cade picked it up and turned it in his hand. Then he slipped it into his jacket pocket. He put the backpack back in exactly the same place, at exactly the same angle, exactly the same distance from the bed. Then he walked out, without a sound. In the study downstairs, Cade inserted the USB drive into his computer. The screen lit up. The only folder inside carried a string of numbers with no obvious meaning. He opened it. Hundreds of files, spreadsheets, scanned contracts, photographs of documents, lists of names with addresses beside them. Amounts of money. A great deal of money. Cade moved through the files one by one, slowly, carefully. He didn't see the full picture yet. The pieces were scattered and not yet connected, but the instinct of a man who had spent 37 years on the dark side of the world told him that this was dangerous. Not dangerous in the way of a gun or a knife, but dangerous in the way of a bomb, the kind that sits still until someone touches the fuse. He pulled out the USB drive, held it in his hand, and looked at it beneath the desk lamp. The woman upstairs didn't know what she was carrying. The question was whether someone out there did. About 14 kilometers to the south, in the alley where Elise had been lying against the wall just a few nights earlier, a man stood in the misting rain and cursed. Warren Holden, 34 years old, hair cut short, square jaw, eyes always red from liquor, and too little sleep. He had turned this alley inside out for the third time in 3 days. He had overturned every trash can, kicked through every pile of cardboard, shined a flashlight into every dark corner. Nothing. No Elise, no boy, no backpack. He kicked the brick wall, the toe of his boot striking the concrete with a dull, ugly sound in the night. One of his men stood behind him in silence, knowing this wasn't the moment to open his mouth. Warren pulled out his phone. His hand shook a little, not from the cold, but from something closer to fear than he wanted to admit. He dialed. The person on the other end answered after 3 rings. No greeting. "I still haven't found it," Warren said, his voice trying to stay calm but unable to hide the urgency underneath. Silence stretched for a few seconds. Then a voice came through, low, slow, controlling every syllable as if each word had been weighed before being spoken. "You told me you kept it somewhere safe." "I did, but my wife." "I don't care about your wife." The voice cut across him, no louder, but sharper. "I care about the USB drive. It has everything in it. Names, numbers, addresses. Do you understand what everything means?" Warren swallowed. He understood. "Find it," the voice continued. "I don't care where she is or what she's doing. I need that USB drive back in my hands. Otherwise," a pause, "you understand." The line went dead. Warren stood in the alley, the phone still pressed to his ear even though the call had ended. Mist clung to his shoulders. He looked down at the wet concrete where his wife had been lying a few nights earlier, and now there was nothing left but dirty water and an empty plastic bottle rolling near the trash can. Someone had taken her. Someone with a car. With people. With a reason to be out in the middle of the night in this neighborhood. Warren didn't know who. Not yet. But he would find out. Because if he didn't find that USB drive, the one who would die wouldn't be Elise. It would be him. And in the mansion north of the city, Cade Mercer sat in his study, the black USB drive lying still on the desk in front of him. 2 men at opposite ends of the city, both staring into the dark, both knowing a storm was coming. Only neither of them knew yet that the storm would carry them straight into each other. On the morning of the 5th day, Micah came downstairs to the kitchen for the first time since arriving at the mansion. Before that, the boy had only eaten in the bedroom, sitting beside his mother's bed, nibbling a few bites of bread and then setting it down. But that morning Elise was more awake, and she whispered something to her son. And Micah stood up, walked to the bedroom door, looked down the hallway for a long moment, and only then made his way down the stairs. He entered the kitchen the way someone enters unfamiliar territory, feet light, back slightly bent, eyes moving quickly across every corner of the room before choosing where to sit. He chose the chair against the wall, the place where his back could rest against something solid and no one could come up behind him. 7 years old, and he chose a seat the way a soldier chooses a position in a room, always able to see the door, always with a way back. Priest was in the kitchen. He wasn't the kind of man who cooked, but every morning he made his own coffee and put together a few simple things for Cade's breakfast. Today he prepared an extra plate, scrambled eggs and toast. No one told him to do it. He did it on his own when he saw the boy come downstairs. Priest set the plate on the table in front of Micah. There was nothing remarkable in the act itself, just a man placing a plate of food on the table for a child. But Priest was a man used to putting force into everything he did, his hands heavy, steady, and the plate struck the wooden table with a sharp thud louder than it needed to be. What happened took less than a second. Micah jumped out of the chair. His whole body jolted as if electricity had gone through him. The chair scraped backward across the floor. He backed into the corner, his spine pressed flat against the wall behind him, and both hands flew up to cover his face. Not his eyes. His face. Those small arms crossed in front of him, elbows out, head lowered, shoulders pulled in. The posture of a child waiting to be hit. Not a response to the present moment. A reflex. Memory held in the body. The kind of memory that doesn't need the brain to command it, because it lives in the muscles, in the bones, in every nerve trained by blows repeated often enough to teach the body that a loud sound means pain. Priest went still. One hand remained resting on the edge of the plate, his eyes fixed on the boy in the corner, and on the face of a man who had killed without blinking. Something shifted. Not much. Priest wasn't the sort of man who let emotion show plainly, but his jaw tightened, and the hand on the plate clenched for a brief second, before letting go. Cade stood in the kitchen doorway. He had been standing there before Micah came down, a cup of coffee in his hand, about to step inside. But he stopped when he saw the boy choose the chair against the wall, and he stayed there when the plate struck the table. He saw all of it. The violent start, the chair shoved back, the small arms covering the face, the corner, and then the thing worse than all of that. Micah lowered his hands. He lowered them slowly, looked around, realized no one was going to hit him. No fist, no shouting, only Priest standing beside the table and a plate of scrambled eggs. The boy looked down at the floor for a second, then he went back to the chair, sat down, pulled the chair back to the table, and began to eat, as if nothing had happened. That was the part that left Cade unable to breathe. Not the flinch, not the posture with his face covered, but the way the boy returned to the table and ate as though what had just happened were ordinary. Ordinary. Startle. Cover his face. Wait for the blow. Realize there was no blow. Then continue. How many times had that pattern repeated in the boy's life for it to become something not worth remarking on? How many meals had he sat down to with his arms over his face before picking up a spoon? How many sounds had made him shrink and curl in on himself before he straightened again because there was no one there to help him? No one said a word. Priest didn't speak. Cade didn't speak. Micah didn't speak. Micah had never spoken to them. The kitchen stayed silent except for the light, careful sound of spoon against plate, as if the boy had learned to eat without making noise. Priest looked over at Cade. Cade looked back. Between two men who had spent their whole lives inside violence, no words were needed to understand what they had just witnessed. This child wasn't a child seeing violence for the first time. This child had lived inside it long enough to build an entire survival system before he had even finished learning the alphabet. Cade set his coffee cup down on the kitchen counter. He didn't go in. He turned away, walked down the hallway to his study, closed the door, sat down in his chair. And in the stillness of that empty room, he looked at the black USB drive lying on the desk, remembered the bruises on Elise's wrist, remembered the two small arms covering a face in the kitchen corner, and something old, something heavy, began to stir in the deepest part of his chest. That afternoon, Dr. Park came for her second examination of the day. She stayed longer than usual, nearly 40 minutes instead of the 20 she normally spent. When she stepped out into the hallway, she didn't leave right away. She stood waiting by the staircase, and when Cade walked past, she spoke softly. "Do you have a few minutes?" Cade followed her into the study. "Doctor," Park set her notebook on the desk, opened it to a page, and spoke in the same calm voice she might have used to read blood test results. "Two ribs on the left side show signs of old fractures. They've healed, but badly aligned. They were never treated." She turned the page. "There are 4 scars on her back, long in shape, about 10 to 15 centimeters, lying parallel to each other. They may have been caused by a hard object in the form of a rod, a belt, or a wooden stick. The scars are old, at least 1 to 2 years." She paused, looked at Cade. "I'm not drawing conclusions. I'm only reporting the facts." Then she closed the notebook, slipped it back into her bag, and rose to her feet. "She's recovering well. The infection in her lungs has eased. I'll come back tomorrow morning." She left. Cade remained alone. He didn't open his mouth the entire time she was speaking. He didn't ask questions. He didn't comment. He simply sat there, both hands resting on the desk, staring into the empty space in front of him. Ribs broken and left to heal on their own, scars across her back from something hard. He thought of Elise's wrist with the finger-shaped bruises. He thought of Micah in the kitchen corner that morning, both arms over his face, then sitting back down to eat, as if nothing had happened. The pieces didn't even need arranging anymore. They had already formed the picture on their own. That night, Cade didn't go to sleep early. He sat in the study until nearly midnight, going through the files on the USB drive again, trying to find the connection between the numbers and the names. Then he stood, went upstairs, intending to check on Elise's room the way he did every night. But when he stopped at the door, he saw the light still shining through the narrow gap where it hadn't fully closed. Micah was curled up on the bed, fast asleep, but Elise was sitting against the headboard, eyes open, looking toward the window where the curtains hadn't been fully drawn. The streetlight outside cast a faint stripe of light across the floor. She knew he was standing there. She didn't turn her head, but she spoke. Her voice was flat, not shaking, not breaking, carrying none of the emotion a person might expect from the words she was about to say. It was as though she were reading a line written on a wall or recounting yesterday's weather. "The first time he hit me, Micah was 6 months old." Cade stood still in the doorway. He didn't step in. He didn't step away. "I dropped a bowl of soup." She said nothing more. Only those 2 sentences. "The first time he hit me, Micah was 6 months old. I dropped a bowl of soup." Those 2 sentences hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Cade had ever heard in his life. Not because of what they said, but because of the voice that carried them. The voice of someone who had told this story to herself so many times it no longer made her cry. The voice of someone who had normalized pain until it became a fact, the same way Dr. Park had read her medical report that afternoon. Long scars 10 to 15 centimeters. Ribs broken and left to heal on their own. "The first time he hit me was because I dropped a bowl of soup." Facts. Cade didn't ask anything more. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "Everything's going to be all right." He said nothing at all, because he knew there were no words large enough for this moment, and any words at all would have sounded false in a room where the truth had just been laid down as gently as a falling leaf. He went back to his own room, lay down on the bed, closed his eyes, and the memory came. It didn't ask permission. It didn't knock. It crashed over him like water breaking through a dam. 12 years old. The old house on the west side of the city. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. The sound of a bottle set down on the table. Then shouting. Then blows. Cade lying under the bed. Body curled tight. Both hands over his ears, but not pressed hard enough to keep the sound out. The next room. His little sister. 8 years old. Blonde hair. Calling his name through the wall. Cade. Not screaming. Just calling. As if she knew he was there, and only needed him to know she needed him. He didn't dare come out. He lay beneath the bed, eyes squeezed shut, hands pressed harder over his ears, begging for it all to stop. It did stop, but not in the way he had prayed for. The next morning, his sister didn't wake up. Cade opened his eyes in the darkness of his present bedroom. White ceiling, lights off, silence. He lay there until morning, unable to sleep another minute. The next morning, he went to find Elise. She was sitting on the bed, Micah lying beside her, the early sunlight coming through the curtains. Cade stood in the doorway, a few steps away from her. He didn't come any closer. He didn't crowd her. He spoke in a low, slow voice, each word clear, as if he wanted to make certain she heard every one of them and believed every one of them. "He won't touch you again." Elise looked at him. For a long time, her eyes didn't search for the door, didn't search for a way out, didn't measure the distance to the nearest exit. For the first time since she had opened her eyes in this room, her eyes only looked at him. Then she nodded. Slightly, a nod so small it was almost invisible, but Cade saw it, and he understood that nod wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the thing that comes before trust, something smaller than trust, more fragile than trust, easier to break than trust. It was the moment when a person decides to stop looking for the way out. In the second week, Elise began stepping out of the room without needing any particular reason. At first, it was only to walk slowly along the hallway, one hand against the wall because her body still hadn't fully recovered, then down the stairs, into the kitchen, to pour herself a glass of water, then standing at the living room window, looking out over the front yard. Each day she went a little farther, like a small animal testing new territory, step by step, always ready to turn and run at any moment. And in the course of that quiet exploration, Elise began to notice things that in the first week she had been too weak or too frightened to see. She saw two men standing guard at the gate, rotating in 12-hour shifts, dressed in dark suits, communication devices in their ears. She saw that Priest always carried something at his waist, hidden beneath his jacket but never completely concealed when he bent down. She saw the way the house staff lowered their heads when Cade passed by, not with politeness, but with fear tinged with reverence. She heard the late-night phone calls, Cade's voice carrying softly from the study. Low, brief, issuing orders. Elise wasn't stupid. She had lived long enough with a man on the edge of the criminal world to recognize the scent of hidden power when it stood right in front of her. One afternoon, while Micah was sitting upstairs in the sitting room drawing pictures and Cade passed through the hallway, Elise stopped him. She stood 3 steps away from him, her back against the wall, her arms folded over her chest. "Who are you really?" Cade stopped, looked at her. "Someone you shouldn't trust." The answer came quickly, as if he had prepared it long ago, or had spoken it too many times to too many people. But Elise didn't back down. She looked straight into his eyes and said something that left Cade with no answer at first. "I lived with the man I trusted for 7 years." The sentence hung in the hallway, heavier than the walls. Cade looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything more. Then Cade gave a slight nod and walked away. She didn't know whether he nodded in agreement, in respect, or because he had nothing to say, but she knew he had heard her. A few days later, something happened in the kitchen. Elise was standing at the counter, pouring water, her back to the door. Cade came in, saw that the glass she needed was on the high shelf behind her, and stepped forward to reach for it. His arm lifted above her head, fast, unthinking, the way any tall man would reach for something on a shelf. Elise flinched. Her whole body jerked sideways, her back striking the edge of the kitchen counter, her hand flying up to cover her face. Reflex. Exactly the same reflex Micah had shown in the kitchen corner that morning before. Like mother, like son. The same fear, the same memory held in the body. Water spilled across the floor. The glass fell but didn't break, rolling over the stone countertop before stopping against the cabinet base. Silence. Cade stood still, his hand still raised near the shelf. Then he lowered it, very slowly, inch by inch, as if he were moving near a frightened animal, and knew that any sudden motion would make it bolt. "I was only getting the glass," he said, his voice lower than usual. Elise lowered her hand. Her face had gone red, not from fear anymore, but from something worse than fear. Shame. She was ashamed of her own reflex, ashamed that her body had betrayed her in front of someone else, ashamed that she couldn't control the thing Warren had driven into her bones over 7 years. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You never need to apologize for that," Cade said. Then he added 3 more words. "Not ever again." He stepped back once, then walked out of the kitchen. After that day, Elise noticed something had changed. Cade didn't stand behind her anymore. Whenever he entered a room where she was, he knocked first, even the sitting room. He didn't lift his hand suddenly when he was near her. When they crossed in a narrow hallway, he stopped and let her walk ahead instead of moving beside her. Small changes. No one announced them. No one spoke of them. But Elise noticed every single one, because she was the kind of person who had learned to read a man's body language the way other people read a weather report, to know whether a storm was coming. And the body language of Cade Mercer was saying something she wasn't used to hearing. It said that he was trying not to frighten her. That afternoon, Cade was sitting in the study going through the files on the USB drive again when he heard small footsteps outside the door. He looked up. Micah stood in the doorway. The boy looked at Cade, then walked in and set a folded sheet of paper on the desk. He didn't say anything. Then he turned and walked back out, disappearing into the hallway. Cade looked at the paper, opened it. Inside was a drawing done in colored pencil. Crooked, wobbly, exactly the kind of drawing a 7-year-old child would make. 3 figures. One figure the tallest, with black hair. One smaller figure, with long brown hair. One smallest figure, with short brown hair. All 3 were standing beside each other, And around those 3 figures, the boy had drawn one large square. 4 walls, a triangle roof above, a house. Cade looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he folded it back up carefully, along the same crease Micah had made. He pulled open the desk drawer. Inside the drawer there was only one thing, a handgun resting on black felt. Cade placed the drawing beside the gun. Then he closed the drawer. Now the drawer held 2 things, the gun of a crime boss, and the drawing of a house made by a 7-year-old boy who couldn't speak a single word. Cade's phone vibrated at 10 o'clock that morning. Not a call. A message. From an unknown number. No text. Only a photograph. Cade opened it, and the blood in his body turned cold. The photograph was of Micah. The boy was standing by the 2nd-floor window of the mansion, one hand touching the glass, looking out at the garden. Morning light fell across his face. The image was sharp, taken with a telephoto lens from outside the fence, at an angle, through a gap in the leaves. There was no message attached, no threat, no demand, only the photograph. And that was the most frightening part of all, because the sender didn't need to write anything else. The photograph itself was the message. We know this place. We can see the child. We can come whenever we want. Cade set the phone down on the desk, called for Priest. Triple security. Sweep every camera outside the fence. Find where this picture was taken. Priest looked at the image, his jaw tightening. He nodded, stepped out, and pulled out his phone to contact the security team at once. 20 minutes later, Priest came back into the study. The security team had identified the spot where the photograph was taken, a patch of bushes near the eastern fence, about 40 meters from Micah's window. There were shoe prints in the soft ground, but the person who had taken the picture was gone, probably since the night before or the early hours of the morning. Priest sat down across from Cade. I've checked everything. Cade looked at him and waited. Warren Holden, her husband. He works for Brandt Kessler. Cade didn't move, but his eyes changed. The name Kessler. He knew that name. Brandt Kessler, 50 years old, the dirty real estate boss who controlled the southern part of Chicago. The man who had bought up dozens of poor people's homes for nothing, through threats and violence. The man who bribed officials to change zoning. The man Cade had been facing in an underground territorial war for the past 2 years, without yet having enough proof to make the final strike. Kessler. Cade looked down at the black USB drive lying on the desk, then looked back at Priest. All the scattered pieces from the past few days suddenly fell into place, clear as the sound of a lock snapping open. The USB drive wasn't worthless at all. It contained records of Kessler's dirty dealings, names, amounts of money, addresses, evidence of bribery. Everything needed to bring down the empire Kessler had spent 2 decades building. And Elise, the thin woman lying upstairs, had carried it out of Warren's house without even knowing, simply because it had been in the same drawer as her son's birth certificate. Kessler wants the USB, Priest said. He sent Warren to find it. Warren couldn't because she's here. The photograph came from Kessler's people. Cade nodded. They don't know what she has yet. They only know she took it. But they'll figure it out soon. Cade stood up. He picked up the USB drive, picked up the phone, and went upstairs. Elise was sitting up in bed reading a book one of the house staff had brought her. Micah lay beside her, drawing. When Cade knocked and stepped in, Elise looked up. Her eyes were still wary, but they no longer searched for an escape the way they had in the first week. She looked at him and waited. I need to tell you something, Cade said. Can Micah stay? Elise looked at her son, then nodded. She wasn't going to hide him from anything anymore. Cade handed her the phone. Elise looked at the photograph. Her hand began to shake. Not a slight tremor, but a shake so hard the phone nearly slipped from her fingers. She saw her son through the lens of someone standing beyond the fence, looking into the house the way a hunter looks at prey. Her face went white. Warren, she whispered. Not just Warren, Cade said. He sat down in the chair across from the bed. Your husband works for a man named Brandt Kessler. Kessler is a real estate boss on the south side of the city. He buys houses through threats, bribery, and violence. And the USB drive you were carrying in your backpack contains all the evidence of those deals? Elise looked at him. Her eyes widened. I didn't know, she said, her voice breaking. I only took it because Micah's birth certificate was in there. I only needed the birth certificate so. I know, Cade said. This isn't your fault. Silence stretched between them. Micah stopped drawing, looked at his mother, looked at Cade, then looked back at his mother. He set the pencil down and quietly moved closer against Elise's side. Then something changed in Elise's face. The fear was still there, but behind it, rising now, was something else. Anger. Her eyes sharpened. Her jaw tightened. Her hand stopped shaking. "How many years?" she said, her voice low now, no longer a whisper but clear in every word. "How many years I've been running. How many years I've been shielding Micah. And now, even when I did nothing, they still came for my son." She looked at Cade. "What are you going to do?" Cade looked back at her, and in that moment, he didn't see the thin woman dying in an alley on a rainy night. He saw the woman sitting upright in bed, eyes burning, hand clenched tight, ready for whatever came next. "The better question," Cade said slowly, "is what are you going to do?" Cade laid out the plan that very evening, in the downstairs study. Elise sat across from him. Priest had already taken Micah upstairs to bed. Cade spoke plainly, with no detours. He would copy all the data from the USB drive, send one copy to his private lawyer, and another to an investigative journalist he trusted. Once the evidence was made public, Kessler would come under investigation, his dirty real estate empire would collapse, and Warren would be arrested along with the man he worked for. But there was one condition. The evidence from the USB drive would be far stronger if a direct witness came forward to confirm it. Someone who knew Warren worked for Kessler, someone who had lived in Warren's house and could prove the connection between those two men. Someone named Elise Holden. Elise listened to all of it, in silence, her fingers laced together in her lap, tightening and loosening, then tightening again. She looked down at the floor, then looked up. "If I testify," she said slowly, "Warren will know where I am. Yes. The press will know my face. Yes. I'll have to tell everything. In court. In front of strangers. All of it. Yes." Elise closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they no longer held the anger they had carried that afternoon. Only exhaustion remained, the kind that lay deeper than the body, buried in the bones, in the part of the soul that had been wrung dry through too many years of running. "I've caused enough trouble already," she said. "I should leave. Take Micah and go. Go somewhere far away. You've already helped enough. I can't. If you walk out now..." Cade cut in, his voice not cold but clear, each word set before her like a stone laid on a table. "Kessler finds you in 24 hours. Elise looked at him. "Not because of you," Cade went on. "Because of the USB drive. He knows you had it. He doesn't know who you've given it to. And Kessler isn't the kind of man who lets witnesses live." That last sentence fell into the room like a stone dropped down a well. Elise heard it hit the bottom. She understood. She understood that she no longer had any safe choice left. That the door she had thought she could still walk through and keep running had already closed, though she hadn't known when. That taking the USB drive that night, even by accident, had pulled her into a war larger than anything she had ever tried to escape. And what broke wasn't her will. Elise's will had grown harder than steel after 7 years of living with Warren. What broke was endurance. The tears came without warning. No sobbing, no gasping, just tears slipping down her cheeks, quiet and steady, like water from a broken faucet no one had fixed. She didn't wipe them away. She sat there, her hands still laced in her lap, her back still straight, her eyes still open, and yet the tears kept falling. It wasn't the crying of fear. Cade knew what fear looked like when it cried. This was the crying of someone utterly spent, of someone who had carried everything alone for too long, run alone for too far, kept her son safe with her bare hands through too many nights, and was now realizing that no matter how strong she had been, it still hadn't been enough, that the world kept knocking her down, every time she had just managed to rise. Cade didn't hold her. He didn't touch her. He didn't say everything would be all right, or any of the other things people say when they don't know what else to say. He stood up from his chair, walked around to her side, and sat down on the floor, his back against the leg of the desk, about an arm's length away from her, close enough for her to know he was there, far enough that she wouldn't feel trapped. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," he said. He didn't look at her. He looked straight ahead. His voice was low, even, but each word carried the weight of a man saying something that surprised even himself as he heard it leave his mouth. "Not this time." Elise didn't answer. The tears kept falling, but she didn't get up and walk away. She stayed where she was, and the truth that she remained sitting there, in the room of a man she didn't yet fully trust, was the closest thing to surrender Elise Holden would allow herself. The sound of small footsteps on the stairs. Micah appeared in the doorway of the study. He couldn't sleep, or he had heard something, or perhaps instinct had simply pulled him toward the place where his mother was. He walked in, didn't look at Cade, and went straight to her, sat down beside her chair, rested his head against her shoulder. One hand reached for his mother's hand. The three of them sat there in the study. No one spoke. Outside the window, the city was still lit, still moving, still breathing. But in that room, time stopped long enough for three broken people to sit beside one another, without having to explain why they were there. Micah fell asleep first. The boy lay curled up on the upstairs bed, the blanket pulled to his chin, his hand still lightly clutching the hem of his mother's shirt, even though Elise had eased him onto the pillow some time before. Elise sat beside her son a while longer, making sure his breathing was steady, making sure his forehead wasn't warm, making sure of all the things a mother always makes sure of, even when she herself is falling apart. Then she stood, gently loosened Micah's fingers from her shirt, stepped outside, closed the door. She couldn't sleep. After the conversation in the study, after the tears, after the three of them had sat in silence beside one another, Elise had taken Micah upstairs and stayed with him until he drifted off. But she hadn't. Her mind was spinning. Kessler, the USB drive, testifying. Warren. Each word turned in her head like shards of broken glass she didn't know how to fit back together. She went down the stairs, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, meaning to go to the kitchen and pour herself a glass of water. But as she passed the study, she saw the light. Not the overhead light. The desk lamp. A weak golden glow slipping through the half-open door, falling in a thin line across the hallway floor. Elise stopped. She hadn't meant to look in, but her feet stopped before her mind gave the order, and her eyes moved on their own toward the crack in the door. Cade was sitting at the desk. Alone. No laptop open. No papers in front of him. No phone. Just him, and in front of him, on the dark wooden surface of the desk, a small photograph. The photograph sat in a thin metal frame, the old kind, slightly tarnished. Elise couldn't make out the picture clearly from where she stood, but she could see something else. Cade was touching the photograph. His fingertip rested lightly against the glass, moving slowly, very slowly, as if he were brushing dust away from someone, or touching a face he no longer had the right to touch. That gesture, his finger gliding softly across the glass of the picture, so gently it was almost trembling. Cade Mercer, the boss who controlled half the underground operations on the south side of Chicago, the man whose name made others lower their heads, was sitting alone at nearly midnight, touching a photograph with a tenderness no one in this world would have believed his hands were capable of. Elise swallowed. She meant to step back, to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen anything. But the wooden floor beneath her foot gave a small creak, small enough that anyone else might have ignored it. But Cade wasn't anyone else. He turned. His eyes met hers through the crack in the door. For a second, Elise waited for him to hide the photograph, waited for him to shut the door, waited for anger because she had seen something he hadn't wanted anyone to see. But Cade did none of those things. He looked at her, then looked back at the photograph. He didn't hide it. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't explain. The photograph remained there on the desk beneath the yellow light, and Elise could see it more clearly now. A little girl, blonde hair, softly curled at the ends, smiling. A wide smile, the kind children have, the kind that doesn't yet know the world can hurt them. 8 or 9 years old, bright eyes. Someone had loved this little girl. Someone still did. Elise pushed the door open a little more. "I can't sleep either," she said. Her voice was soft. She didn't ask permission to come in. She didn't ask who the girl in the photograph was. She only offered a simple truth. "I'm awake too." Cade looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Elise stepped inside and sat down in the chair across from the desk. Between them were the wooden desk, the photograph of the blonde girl, the black USB drive, and the yellow light. No one said anything. Elise didn't ask about the girl in the photograph. Cade didn't explain. The silence between them wasn't the kind of silence that feels awkward and needs to be filled with words. It was the kind of silence that belongs to two people still awake in the middle of the night, both carrying something too heavy to sleep with, and realizing that sometimes the presence of another person is enough. No telling, no knowing. only knowing that on the other side of the desk, there is someone else breathing, someone else awake, someone else carrying a weight. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 15. Cade sat still. Elise sat still. The sound of the hallway clock came in softly, steadily. Then Elise spoke, without looking up. Her eyes rested on the photograph of the blonde girl, but she didn't ask about the girl. She spoke of something else. "I'll testify." Cade looked at her. "Are you sure?" Elise lifted her eyes. They were dry now. No more tears, no trace of the shattered exhaustion from a few hours earlier. What was in her eyes now was something harder, clearer, like the surface of a lake after the storm has passed, flat in a way that is almost frightening. "I'm sure," she said, "because this time, I'm not running for myself." She looked toward the staircase, where Micah was sleeping upstairs. "I'm running so Micah never has to run again." The sentence stayed in the room after she rose and went back upstairs. Cade remained there alone, looking at his sister's photograph, looking at the USB drive, then looking at the empty space where Elise had just been sitting, the chair still holding a trace of warmth. And he realized that for the first time in many years, this mansion felt like something he had forgotten long ago. Not a home, not yet, but something moving in that direction. The next morning, for the first time since Elise and Micah had come to the mansion, everything looked like an ordinary morning. The November sunlight was weak but clear as it came through the kitchen windows, falling into bright squares across the wooden table. No rain. The sky was dry for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Elise sat at the kitchen table, not curled up close to the wall the way she had been the other time she came down here. She sat in the middle chair, her back still straight, but her shoulders less rigid now, both hands wrapped around a glass of warm water, her eyes turned toward the window where the sunlight was brightening the strip of garden in front of the mansion. Beside her, Micah sat on a chair raised higher with a cushion, a stack of white paper and a box of colored pencils in front of him, the very ones one of the house staff had bought on Cade's orders back on the 3rd day. He was drawing, not the kind of drawing done in a hurried scribble. He was drawing slowly, carefully, his head tilted to one side, the tip of his tongue peeking out a little at the corner of his mouth the way children do when they are concentrating with their whole heart. Priest stood at the counter with his back to the table, making coffee. The machine gave off a soft, simmering sound, and the smell of coffee spread through the kitchen, mingling with the scent of toasted bread. And there was something else today. Priest hadn't brought his gun to the table. Every morning before this, whenever Priest made coffee in the kitchen, the handgun had always rested on the counter beside the machine, within reach, like an ordinary object no different from a spoon or a sugar jar. This morning, the kitchen counter held only glasses, plates, and the coffee pot. No one said anything about it. Maybe Priest didn't even realize he had done something different, or maybe he did realize it, but didn't want to admit that the presence of a 7-year-old boy had altered a habit he had carried for 15 years. Cade stepped into the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway, not because anything was out of place, but because everything was too ordinary. He looked at Elise sitting at the table, her hands around the glass of water, the sunlight touching her light brown hair and making it seem brighter than usual. He looked at Micah bent over his drawing, the blue pencil in his hand coloring in something round on the page. He looked at Priest pouring coffee, with no gun on the counter. 4 people. A warm kitchen. Morning light. The smell of coffee. Cade couldn't remember the last time he had seen a scene like this. Maybe he never had. This mansion had 12 rooms, 4 floors, a security system worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a wine cellar he had never opened. But never, in all the years he had lived here, had it held a morning like this. He walked in and sat down at the head of the table. Priest didn't turn around, but he knew Cade had arrived, because 10 seconds later, a cup of black coffee was set in front of him. No sugar, no milk, like every morning. Cade took a sip. Micah lifted his head from the paper. He looked at his mother, then held up the drawing. Elise tilted her head to see it. This drawing wasn't 3 figures inside a square the way the last one had been, the one he had given Cade before. This time he had drawn a large tree, its branches spreading wide, and beneath the tree there was a bench, and on the bench sat 2 figures side by side. One smaller figure was running across the grass in front of them. Elise smiled, softly, a small smile, only the faintest lift at the corners of her mouth, but it was real, not forced, not polite. She smiled because her son's drawing held green grass and a big tree and yellow sunlight, because inside the mind of her 7-year-old boy who couldn't speak a word to strangers, there was still room for things that beautiful, because after everything that had happened, Micah still drew pictures of people sitting together beneath a tree. "It's beautiful," she whispered to him. Micah looked at his mother, then looked over at Cade. He didn't hold the picture up for Cade to see. Not yet. But he looked at him longer than usual, before lowering his head and going back to his drawing. Cade drank his coffee. Elise drank her warm water. Micah drew. Priest leaned back against the counter, his own coffee cup in his hand, his eyes on the window. 4 people in the kitchen. No one spoke much. No one needed to. The sunlight moved slowly across the table, from the plate of bread to Micah's drawing paper, then onto Elise's hands wrapped around the glass. The pencil made a soft scratching sound against the page. The coffee machine stopped simmering and clicked off. Somewhere out in the garden, the distant call of a bird drifted faintly through the air. This moment, this one moment, in the whole story, this was the point where everything stood still. No one was chasing anyone. There was no USB drive, no photograph taken in secret, no name Kessler, no Warren. There were only 4 people sitting in a kitchen on a morning filled with sunlight. And none of those 4 people knew that this was the last morning before everything changed. Because tonight, Warren Holden would make his final move. 11 o'clock at night. Red and blue lights flashed through the curtains of the ground floor sitting room. 3 police cars were parked in front of the mansion gates, their revolving lights sweeping across the front of the house like knives cutting through the dark. Priest looked through the security camera feed, his jaw tightening. "Police," he said to Cade, his voice tense. 3 cars. At least 6 officers. His hand had already gone to his waist by reflex, but he knew, and Cade knew, that what sat at his waist wouldn't solve this. Guns could handle a great many things in their world, but not a search warrant and not an arrest warrant. Cade rose from his chair in the study, calmly. He fastened his shirt button, smoothed the cuff of his sleeve, and walked to the front door as if he were going to greet guests, not face law enforcement just before midnight. He opened the gate. 2 officers stood there, one holding paperwork, the other resting a hand on his holster. Behind them, 4 more stood spaced around the cars. "Cade Mercer?" "Yes." "We've received a report of kidnapping and unlawful confinement. A woman named Elise Holden and her son, Micah Holden. The reporting party is Warren Holden, the victim's husband." Cade didn't move. His face didn't change. Not surprise, not anger, not fear. He had spent his whole life in a world where the wrong expression could get a person killed. "Come in," he said, and stepped aside. The 2 officers looked at each other. They had prepared for many possibilities. A locked gate, a lawyer, resistance, maybe even a confrontation. They hadn't prepared for the suspect opening the gate and inviting them inside. They stepped through, walked up the drive, and entered the ground floor sitting room. Priest stood at the foot of the staircase, his eyes tracking every movement, but both hands hung loose now, no longer touching his waist. Cade had given the order with a glance when he passed him. The order was clear. Do nothing. The officer holding the paperwork began speaking about procedure, about authority, about the need to see Elise Holden to confirm her condition. Cade listened, nodded where appropriate, answered exactly what was asked. Perfect cooperation. And just as the officer finished speaking, the sound of footsteps came down from the top of the stairs. Everyone looked up. Elise stood there at the landing. She had heard the police lights through the bedroom window, had seen the red and blue wash across the ceiling, and she knew at once. Warren. She knew this move. He had used it before. The time she had tried to leave when Micah was 4, Warren called the police and said she was mentally unstable, that she needed to be brought home. The police came, saw a worried husband and a panicked wife, and they took her back. Back to him. That time she hadn't been able to speak. That time she had been too afraid, too shaky, crying too hard, and everything she said sounded like the words of someone losing control. This time was different. Elise came down the stairs, 1 step at a time, slowly, not because she was weak, but because each step was a decision. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She walked straight up to the 2 officers and spoke. Her voice was rough but clear, each word placed carefully, the way a person lays bricks to build a wall. "I'm Elise Holden. I'm here completely of my own free will. I left my husband's house because of years of domestic abuse. I have medical evidence." The 2 officers looked at her. looked at the bruises on her wrist that had faded yellow, looked at the way she stood upright, even though she was so thin her blouse hung loose on her shoulders. "Can you provide evidence?" one officer asked. "Yes." Cade pulled out his phone and made a call. 10 minutes later, Dr. Park arrived. She brought the notebook she had kept so carefully since that first night. Medical records, her condition on admission, pneumonia, malnutrition, old broken ribs, scars across her back, finger-shaped bruises on her wrist. She presented everything in a professional voice, calm, impartial. Facts, only facts. The two officers read the report, looked at each other, looked at Elise, looked at Cade. The situation was clearly far more complicated than a kidnapping report. They asked a few more questions. Elise answered every one. No hesitation. No contradictions. At last, the older officer closed the file. "We'll take her statement into the record. At this time, there are no grounds for forcible action." They left. The red and blue lights faded as the police cars backed out through the gates. Elise stood on the front steps of the mansion, watching them go. A light drizzle had begun again, soft and cold, and then she saw him. Warren stood across the street beneath the shadow of a maple tree stripped bare of leaves. The streetlight cut across half his face. He was looking at her, waiting. Waiting for the familiar thing, waiting for her to lower her head, waiting for her to turn away, waiting for her to fold in on herself and become the smaller version of who she had once been, the version he had spent 7 years creating. Elise looked straight into his eyes. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't turn away. She didn't fold in on herself. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. Her eyes held something Warren had never seen in her before. The end. She was finished. Finished with him. Finished with the fear that wore his name. Finished with everything he had ever been in her life. Cade stepped out and stood beside Elise. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He only stood there. And Warren looked at the two of them on the steps, his wife and the stranger standing beside her, the light from the front of the mansion falling across them both. And he understood. Too late, but he understood. He had lost. The next morning, Cade set the laptop in front of Elise on the desk in the study, already open and ready. The screen displayed 2 emails that had been fully drafted. One was addressed to the Federal Investigative Agency. The other was addressed to the investigative journalist Cade had already contacted in advance. Both had the entire contents of the USB drive attached, transaction records, names, amounts of money, evidence of bribery, everything. Cade stood beside the desk. He didn't sit down. "This is your decision," he said. Elise looked at the screen. The cursor blinked softly over the send button. She looked at the 2 emails, looked at the list of attached files, looked at the line-marked recipient with addresses she had never known existed. Her hand rested on the desk, a few inches from the keyboard, shaking. Not shaking from fear, shaking because she knew that the moment she pressed that button, nothing would ever go back. Warren would know. Kessler would know. The world would know. And she, Elise Holden, the woman who had lived for 7 years in silence and darkness, would step out into the light. She looked over at Cade. He didn't nod. He didn't urge her on. He didn't say do it. He only stood there, and his presence said the sentence his mouth didn't need to speak. "I'm here. Whatever you choose." Elise turned back to the screen, set her finger on the mouse, and clicked, twice. 2 emails. Sent. The screen showed the confirmation message. The message had been sent. Elise let out a breath. Not the breath of relief, but the breath of someone who had just cut the last cord tying her to her old life. Everything after that moved faster than she had imagined. That same afternoon, Cade's phone rang. An unknown number, but Cade knew who was calling before he answered. Mercer. The voice on the other end was low, slow, controlled. The voice Cade had heard described by many people but had never heard directly until today. Brant Kessler. "You think this is a victory?" Kessler asked. Not angry, not shouting. His voice was flat as the surface of a frozen lake, the kind of flatness with deadly cold water underneath. Cade sat in the study, looking out the window where the evening light was beginning to fade. "No," he said. Silence on the other end. "But the woman you meant to leave for dead in the rain?" Cade continued, his voice no louder, no softer, every word even and steady, just might. The line went dead. Kessler hung up. It was the first time and the last time the two men ever spoke directly. 3 days later, the federal agency opened an official investigation. Kessler's accounts were frozen. His real estate offices were searched. The dirty transaction records matched the data on the USB drive completely. The journalist published the first investigative piece, detailed, sourced, supported by evidence. The empire Brant Kessler had built over 20 years began to collapse from the inside. Warren Holden was arrested on the 5th day. Not in a bar, not on the street. He was arrested in a temporary rental apartment on the south side of the city, where he had been hiding since the night the police came to Cade's mansion. The charges were aiding illegal transactions tied to Kessler, and domestic abuse supported by medical records. Dr. Park's records, Elise's testimony, the scars on her back, the ribs that had healed on their own after being broken. All of it. A week later, Elise sat at Cade's desk again. In front of her this time wasn't a laptop but a stack of papers. Divorce papers. Cade's lawyer had prepared them. Elise took the pen. Her hand shook. Not from hesitation. It shook because for 7 years she had lived inside the name Holden. 7 years she had carried it like a mark burned into her skin that she had never chosen. And now she was about to strike it away. She signed. The handwriting trembled, but it was clear. Each letter of her name appeared across the line. Not beautiful, but certain. The way she had survived everything. Not beautifully, but still here. She set the pen down, looked at the signature, then looked out the window. The late afternoon sun was falling into the room. She let out a breath. That night, Micah sat on the bed beside his mother. He held a pencil and a small sheet of paper, writing slowly, the letters slanting and uneven but readable. He folded the note and handed it to her. Elise opened it. 4 words. "Will Dad come back?" Elise looked at the line, looked at her son. Micah sat beside her, gray eyes lifted to hers, waiting. Not frightened, not hopeful, just waiting. The way he had waited for everything in his life, with a patience far too large for a 7-year-old child. Elise knelt down on the floor until she was level with his eyes. She placed both hands on his shoulders, gently, firmly. "No," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper. It didn't shake. It was as clear as the signature she had just placed on the divorce papers. Never again. Micah looked at his mother, for a long moment. Then the boy nodded. And for the first time, Elise saw it, so small, so quick, the corner of his mouth lifting. Not yet a smile. But the place where a smile begins. The following afternoon, Priest knocked on the door of Cade's study. He stepped inside, stopped in front of the desk, folded his arms across his chest, and spoke in the same even tone a man might use to report the weather. "Kessler is under investigation. Warren is in jail. The threat is over." Cade looked up from the stack of papers on his desk, looked at Priest. "She's safe now," Priest went on. "The boy too. They can leave whenever they want." Cade didn't answer. He looked at Priest, then down at the surface of the desk, then out the window where the light of late afternoon was slowly turning from gold to amber. Priest waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. He knew Cade well enough to know that when the silence stretched too long, it meant the answer wasn't simple. "Boss?" "I heard you," Cade said. "I'll talk to her." Priest nodded, turned to go, but before he crossed the doorway, he stopped. He didn't turn back. He only stood there for a second, as if he wanted to say something more, then stepped out into the hall. The door closed behind him. Cade sat there alone. He should have felt relieved. The threat was gone. Kessler was falling. Warren had been arrested. The USB had done what it was meant to do. Everything Priest said was true. They could leave. But those 3 words, "they can leave," stayed in Cade's head like a pebble in a shoe. Small, but he felt it with every step. He thought of the kitchen that morning, Elise sitting there drinking warm water, Micah drawing, Priest making coffee. He thought of the night before, Elise sitting across from him in the study, his sister's photograph on the desk, and the silence between them needing nothing to fill it. He thought of the 7-year-old boy placing a drawing of a house on his desk and walking away without waiting for a response, as if the drawing itself would say enough. Cade opened the desk drawer, looked down. The gun lay on the left. The drawing lay on the right. 3 figures inside a square. He closed the drawer, then opened it again, then closed it once more. For the first time in his life, Cade Mercer didn't know what he wanted. No, he did know. He just wasn't used to wanting something beyond power, beyond territory, beyond victory, wanting the sound of colored pencils moving over paper every morning in the kitchen, wanting a glass of warm water on the table that wasn't his, wanting small footsteps on the staircase every evening, wanting someone to sit across from him at midnight and not need him to explain why he couldn't sleep. Night came. Micah fell asleep early. Elise took her son upstairs, sat beside him until he drifted off, then came back down the staircase. Slowly, quietly, she stopped at the door of the study. The desk lamp was still on inside. Cade was sitting in his chair, staring into the distance. Elise stood in the doorway, hesitating. One hand rested on the frame, her fingers tapping at once, like a knock that wasn't quite strong enough to be called one. Cade looked up. "Micah asked me something," Elise said. Her voice was soft, a little rough, the voice of someone who had practiced the sentence in her mind many times before speaking it aloud. "What did he ask?" Cade said. Elise stepped into the room, one step, then stopped. "He asked if we could stay." The words fell into the room and stayed there between them, heavier than anything that had ever been spoken in that room before. Heavier than the name, Kessler. Heavier than the USB. Heavier than the sentence, "He won't touch you again." Because that question wasn't about safety. It wasn't about shelter. It was about home. The silence stretched between them. Cade looked at Elise. Elise looked at Cade. Neither of them looked away. Then Cade opened the desk drawer. His hand went inside, passed over the gun on the left, and took out the drawing on the right. The folded sheet of paper, a little wrinkled at the corners, the colored pencil already slightly faded. He placed it on the desk between them. 3 figures inside a square. A house. Elise looked down at the drawing. She recognized it. Her son had drawn it. She looked at the tallest figure, dark hair, looked at the smaller figure, brown hair, looked at the smallest figure, short hair, looked at the 4 walls around them. Then she lifted her eyes, looked at Cade, and he saw it. On the face of the woman who had cried in this study from sheer exhaustion, who had stood on the front steps and looked straight into the eyes of the man who used to beat her, who had pressed send on the evidence with trembling fingers, who had signed divorce papers in a steady hand. For the first time since Cade had found her in that rain-soaked alley, Elise Holden smiled. Not the faint smile that only touched the corners of her mouth. A real smile, reaching her eyes, bright, warm. And Cade, a man who hadn't known how to smile since he was 12 years old, looked at that smile and felt something in his chest. Something he had thought died 25 years ago, begin to warm again. Spring came late to Chicago that year, but when it came for real. The grass in the mansion garden turned green in just a few weeks. The maple trees along the fence began to push out tender new leaves, and the afternoon sunlight stretched longer, warmer, as if the whole city were breathing out after a winter that had gone on too long. Elise Holden, or rather Elise with the name she was learning to call her own again, was no longer the gaunt woman lying half dead in a rain-soaked alley. She had gained nearly 15 pounds. There was color in her cheeks now. Her eyes were brighter. Not the kind of brightness that comes from fever or tears, but the kind that belongs to someone beginning to look ahead, instead of always glancing back over her shoulder. She enrolled in evening college classes again, majoring in accounting, and during the day she helped manage part of Cade's legitimate bookkeeping. The work wasn't large, but it was hers, done by her, through her own ability. And each night when she sat down at the table with her textbooks spread before her, Micah sat beside her drawing, mother and son at opposite ends of the table, each doing his or her own work, quiet, but together. Micah changed too, slowly, a little at a time, like grass growing. No one sees it lengthen day by day, but one morning you look out into the yard, and it is green. He began speaking to Priest, not all at once. At first it was one word, yes, when Priest asked whether he wanted more milk, then 2 words, then 3. Then one afternoon, when Priest was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning his gun, out of Micah's sight, though the boy came in unexpectedly, Micah stood in the kitchen doorway, looked at Priest, and spoke an entire sentence. "Do you want to see the picture I drew?" Priest looked up. His hand stopped halfway over the gun. His eyes moved to the boy, then away again faster than usual. And if someone didn't know Priest, he would have missed what just passed across the face of that stone-hard man. But it was there, only for an instant. "Yeah," Priest said, his voice ordinary, as though the boy had just asked whether he wanted coffee. Show me. Micah ran to get the drawing. Priest watched him go, then looked down at the gun on the table. Put it away before the boy came back. That was the quietest victory in this entire story. There was no courtroom, no headline, no applause. Only a 7-year-old child, for the first time in his life, trusting a man enough to speak to him. But Micah still didn't speak to Cade. He still spoke to him through paper, through drawings, through nods, through looks. Cade didn't push. He waited. He had waited 25 years to forgive himself for that night beneath the bed. So a few more months waiting for a child to speak wasn't long at all. Elise still startled. Not often, but sometimes, when someone closed a door a little too hard, or when a sudden noise came from behind her, her shoulders would tighten for an instant. Her eyes would dart toward the sound before she let herself relax again. Cade saw it, every time. He didn't try to cure it. He didn't say you're safe now, because she already knew that. Scars don't disappear just because the wound has healed. They both knew that. They both accepted it. And that acceptance, strangely enough, was a kind of intimacy deeper than words. That afternoon, Cade stood on the second-floor balcony looking down into the garden. The late sunlight laid gold across the green grass. A light wind carried the scent of new leaves. Elise stepped out onto the balcony and stood beside him. She didn't speak. She leaned her shoulder lightly against his arm, so lightly that he could almost not feel it through the fabric of his shirt, but he felt it. He didn't step away. He leaned a little closer. Just enough. Down in the garden, Micah ran across the grass, barefoot, brown hair flying in the wind. He ran around the biggest maple tree, both arms spread wide, his face tilted up. Then he looked up at the balcony, saw the two of them standing there, and waved. Cade waved back. A small gesture, his hand lifted to shoulder height, moving once in the air. A gesture anyone who saw it would have called ordinary, but for Cade Mercer, the man who had used that hand to control an empire, used it to give orders, to threaten, and for many worse things, waving to a child in the garden on a spring afternoon was perhaps the bravest thing he had ever done. Micah ran into the house. The sound of his small footsteps came up the stairs, quick, excited, not the cautious, creeping steps he had carried when he first came here. He ran out onto the balcony, stopped in front of Cade, and tipped his face up to look at him. Big gray eyes, hair messy from the wind, cheeks red from running. The boy looked at Cade and opened his mouth, not to write on paper, not to use a gesture, not to whisper to his mother so she could pass the words along. In his own voice, directly, looking straight into the eyes of the man standing in front of him. Thank you. 2 words. The boy's voice was clear, small, with the faintest tremble at the end, as if he had practiced saying those words many times in his head before daring to speak them aloud. Cade went still. He couldn't say anything. He, the man who had never run out of words in any negotiation, the man who always had an answer for every situation, stood on his own balcony on a spring afternoon and couldn't find a single word, because there weren't any words big enough. He only nodded. And if Elise, standing beside him, had looked closely, she would have seen that his eyes were brighter than usual. Many years later, the people who knew Cade Mercer still remembered him as the man no one dared touch. They remembered the underground empire, remembered the name that made people lower their heads, remembered the half-true, half-invented stories about the man who controlled half the southern outskirts of Chicago. But the story they told most often wasn't about any of those things. It was about a rainy night on the edge of Chicago, when a 7-year-old boy, who couldn't speak a word, walked into a convenience store at midnight, handed the clerk a piece of soaked paper written in pencil, and was turned away. That boy went through 3 doors slammed shut in his face, 3 refusals, 3 times stepping back out into the rain, and continuing to run. Before the 4th door opened, and the one who opened that door was the only person who stopped. That is the story we wanted to bring you today. A story about courage that doesn't need words, about kindness hidden in the places you least expect, and about the truth that sometimes all it takes is one person stopping to change someone else's whole life. In real life, all around us, there are children silently begging for help. There are mothers straining to fight alone. And there are doors closing every day in the faces of the people who need help most. The question is, which door will you be? If this story touched you, please leave a like so we'll know you're here. Please share this video with the people you think need to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next stories. We'd truly love to hear what you felt in the deepest part of your heart. What did this story make you think of? Who in real life did it remind you of? Please share it in the comments below. We read every comment and treasure every line you write. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day ahead. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.